The antiseptic smell of the hospital room made my head spin as I tried to process Margaret's words. My mother-in-law stood at the foot of my bed, perfectly coiffed as always, delivering life-altering news as casually as if she were discussing the weather. The retirement facility is very nice, Claire, she continued, smoothing her designer blazer, much more suitable for someone in your condition. My condition. 2 weeks ago, I'd had knee replacement surgery. According to Margaret, this somehow made me an invalid who needed to be shipped off to a care home. At 58, I was hardly ready for retirement living. Where's David? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. I'd like to discuss this with my husband. Margaret's lips tightened into that familiar look of disapproval she'd perfected over 30 years of making my life difficult. David is handling the paperwork. He agrees this is for the best. After all, that house is far too much for you to manage now. That house, the beautiful Victorian I'd spent the last 20 years restoring, the home where I'd raised my children, where every creaking floorboard and gleaming banister told a story, the property I'd inherited from my grandmother and had legally placed in a trust 3 months ago. After overhearing a very interesting conversation between Margaret and her friend Susan at a family dinner. Really? I said, keeping my voice light. And the buyers didn't mind that the house wasn't actually David's to sell? For a moment, Margaret's perfectly composed facade cracked. What do you mean? Of course it was his to sell. You're his wife. I shifted in the hospital bed, wincing slightly at the twinge in my knee. Actually, Margaret, that house was never in David's name. It was my inheritance, and 3 months ago, I placed it in an irrevocable trust. Any sale would have required my presence and signature as the trustee. The color drained from her face. You're lying. David showed me the paperwork. The paperwork from 15 years ago. Maybe, I said, watching realization dawn in her eyes. But things change, Margaret. People change. Especially when they start having secret conversations about selling their daughter-in-law's house while she's recovering from surgery. My name is Claire Winters, and I've spent 30 years married to a man who never quite managed to cut the apron strings from his controlling mother. Margaret had been there every step of the way, second-guessing my parenting decisions, criticizing my career choices, and trying to orchestrate our lives according to her master plan. 4 years, I'd kept the peace for David's sake, smiling through her backhanded compliments and passive-aggressive suggestions. But 3 months ago, during a family Sunday dinner, I'd excused myself to use the bathroom and overheard Margaret and her friend Susan in the garden below. It's perfect timing, Margaret had said, her voice carrying clearly through the open window. With Claire going in for surgery, David can handle the sale. That house is wasted on her anyway. She's turned it into some kind of bohemian nightmare with all those renovations. The buyers are ready to move quickly, and once it's done, we can get her settled somewhere more appropriate. I'd stood there, frozen, as they discussed my future as if I were a troublesome pet that needed rehoming. That night, I'd called my lawyer, Sarah, and set things in motion. The trust was established within weeks, ironclad and completely legal. I hadn't told David, not because I didn't trust him, but because I knew his mother would read any paperwork he brought home. Now, watching Margaret's carefully constructed plan crumble, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This wasn't how I'd wanted things to go, but she'd left me no choice. Does David know? She demanded, her voice shaking slightly. About this trust? He's about to, I replied, pressing the call button by my bed. In fact, I think it's time we had a family meeting. Why don't you call him up here? Margaret's hands clenched at her sides. You've ruined everything. We had buyers lined up, a lovely couple. David already signed the preliminary paperwork. Preliminary paperwork that's worthless without my signature. I interrupted, and since I never planned to sell my home, I'm afraid your lovely couple will have to look elsewhere. The door opened, and a nurse poked her head in. Everything all right, Mrs. Winters? Yes, thank you, I said. Would you mind calling my husband? He should be downstairs handling some paperwork. David Winters. Tell him it's urgent. Margaret paced the small hospital room like a caged tiger, her expensive heels clicking against the linoleum floor. I could almost see the wheels turning in her head, trying to figure out how to spin this, how to maintain control of a situation that had slipped entirely from her grasp. 10 minutes later, David burst into the room, his face flushed. Claire, what's wrong? Are you okay? I'm fine, I said, patting the edge of my bed, but we need to talk about the house, specifically, about how your mother and you were planning to sell it while I was recovering from surgery. David's face went pale as he looked between his mother and me. Mom, what is she talking about? Margaret stepped forward, her voice taking on that soothing tone she used whenever she was trying to manipulate a situation. David, Darling, I was just explaining to Claire about the wonderful retirement facility we found. It's really for the best. The best for whom? I asked quietly. For me? Or for you and your friends at the country club who never thought I was good enough for your son? That's not fair, Margaret snapped. Everything I've done has been for this family's benefit. That house is too much for you to handle, especially now that I've had a routine knee replacement. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm not an invalid, Margaret. I'm not senile. I'm certainly not ready for a retirement home. And most importantly, that house isn't yours or David's to sell. David sank into the chair by my bed, looking stunned. Mom, you told me Claire had agreed to this. You said she was worried about managing the house during recovery. Oh, David, I sighed, reaching for his hand. After 30 years, do you still believe everything your mother tells you? The silence in the hospital room was deafening. David sat beside my bed, still processing the bombshell I dropped. Margaret had moved to the window, her back rigid with tension as she stared out at the parking lot below. 3 months ago, I continued, my voice steady, I overheard a very interesting conversation between your mother and Susan. They were in the garden, discussing plans to sell my house while I was in surgery. Plans that apparently involved you, David. David's head snapped up. I didn't. Mom just said you'd been worried about managing the house. She said you'd talked about it. When? I asked softly. When did I ever say I wanted to sell my grandmother's house? When did I ever mention wanting to move to a retirement facility? Margaret spun around, her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the fury in her expression. This is ridiculous. David, she's clearly not thinking clearly. The pain medication. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, I cut her off. Clear enough to establish an irrevocable trust 3 months ago, placing the house safely out of reach. Clear enough to have my lawyer document every conversation, every attempt you've made to manipulate this situation. David stood up abruptly, running his hands through his graying hair. Mom, what did you do? What I had to. Margaret snapped. That house has been a burden on this family for years. The maintenance, the repairs, Claire's ridiculous renovations. My renovations that increased the property value by 300%? I interjected. The ones that got featured in Home Design magazine last spring? Those ridiculous renovations? Margaret's face flushed. It's not about the money. It's about what's best for the family. David, surely you can see. What I see, David said slowly, is that you tried to sell my wife's house without her consent. You lied to me, told me Claire had agreed. He trailed off, the weight of the deception finally sinking in. I reached for his hand again, squeezing it gently. The trust was never about you, David. It was about protecting what's mine. What my grandmother left to me. You went behind our backs, Margaret hissed. Secretly setting up trusts, making legal arrangements, like you went behind my back to sell my house? I asked calmly. The difference is, what I did was legal. What you tried to do was fraud. The word hung in the air, like a thundercloud. Margaret's face went pale. Fraud? David repeated, looking between us. Yes, fraud, I confirmed. Attempting to sell property you don't own, forging or coercing signatures, these are serious legal issues, Margaret. My lawyer has documented everything. Margaret sank into a chair, her perfectly maintained facade finally cracking. You wouldn't dare. Think about what this would do to the family. I've thought about nothing else for 3 months, I said. I've thought about 30 years of subtle digs and backhanded compliments. 30 years of you trying to control every aspect of our lives. 30 years of David caught in the middle, trying to keep everyone happy. I turned to my husband, seeing the conflict in his eyes. I love you, David. But this has to stop. Your mother needs to understand that she can't control everything. She can't decide my future for me. David nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. For the first time in our marriage, I saw him truly see his mother for what she was. Mom, he said, his voice firm. You need to leave. Now. We'll discuss this later. Margaret stood up, smoothing her designer outfit with trembling hands. David, please. Now, Mom. She left without another word, her heels clicking against the hospital floor until the sound faded away. David collapsed back into the chair beside my bed, looking exhausted. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I should have seen, should have known." "Yes, you should have," I agreed. "But we both know your mother is very good at what she does. She's had years of practice." Over the next few days, as I continued my recovery, the full extent of Margaret's manipulation came to light. She'd not only lined up buyers for my house, but she'd also put a deposit down at the retirement facility, using David's credit card without his knowledge. She'd told the buyers that I was suffering from early-onset dementia, explaining why the sale needed to be handled discreetly. My lawyer, Sarah, was livid when she heard the details. "This goes beyond family drama, Claire," she said during her visit. "What she attempted was elder abuse and fraud. We have enough evidence to press charges, but I had other plans." A week later, I was discharged from the hospital. David drove me home, to my home, the Victorian that had caused so much drama. As we pulled into the driveway, I saw Margaret's car parked on the street. "I invited her," I said, seeing David's surprise. "We need to clear the air, set some boundaries." Margaret was waiting on the porch, looking smaller somehow, less imposing than she had in the hospital. She watched as David helped me up the steps, my new knee still stiff, but healing. Inside, I settled into my favorite armchair, the one Margaret had always criticized as being too shabby chic for her taste. The afternoon light streamed through the stained glass windows I'd restored myself, casting colorful patterns across the hardwood floors. "Before you say anything," I began, "I want you to look around. Really look at this house, Margaret. Look at what I've built here, what I've restored. This isn't just property to me. It's my legacy, my passion, my home." Margaret's eyes darted around the room, taking in the carefully curated details, the blend of old and new that I'd spent years perfecting. "I won't press charges," I continued, seeing her shoulders relax slightly. "But things are going to change. No more interference, no more manipulation, no more trying to control our lives." "And if I refuse?" she asked, but her voice lacked its usual steel. I smiled, reaching for the folder I'd placed on the side table. "Then Sarah has instructions to proceed with legal action. The documentation of your attempted fraud, the unauthorized credit card charges, the lies you told the potential buyers, it would all come out. Your reputation at the country club wouldn't survive that, would it?" She flinched, and I saw David hide a smile. "But it doesn't have to come to that," I added. "You can choose to respect our boundaries, to accept that David and I are capable of making our own decisions. You can choose to be a mother and grandmother instead of a puppet master." The silence stretched between us as Margaret considered her options. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "The renovation work, it really is quite remarkable." Coming from Margaret, this was practically a surrender. "Thank you," I said simply. "Would you like a tour? I can show you the new kitchen renovation I'm planning once my knee heals completely." That afternoon marked a turning point. It wasn't perfect, Margaret would always be Margaret, but something fundamental had shifted. David stood taller, spoke more firmly, he no longer jumped every time his mother called. As for me, I continued my recovery, working with my physical therapist in the home gym I'd set up in what was once the Victorians' formal dining room. Much to Margaret's horror, the house evolved with me, each room telling a story of resilience and renewal. 6 months later, Home Design magazine returned, this time to feature my home office renovation. The photographer captured me at my desk, the stained glass windows casting their rainbow light across my silver hair. The article title read, "Victorian Revival, How One Woman's Vision Transformed More Than Just a House." Margaret even came to the magazine launch party, bringing a bottle of champagne and only making one small comment about the eccentric wallpaper in the powder room. Progress comes in small steps, after all. As I watched her chatting with the magazine editor, actually praising my design choices, David wrapped his arm around my waist. "You know," he said quietly, "putting the house in trust was brilliant, but not telling me, that must have been hard." I leaned into him, grateful for my healing knee and the man who had finally found his voice. "Sometimes," I replied, "you have to protect what's yours, even from the people you love." He nodded, understanding at last. That evening, after everyone had left, I sat in my beloved shabby chic armchair, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The house creaked and settled around me, its familiar sounds a comfort after all these years. Margaret had tried to take this from me, to decide my future without my consent, but in doing so, she'd forced us all to confront the dynamics that had shaped our family for 3 decades. Sometimes it takes almost losing something to realize how hard you'll fight to keep it. I ran my hand along the arm of my chair, feeling the worn velvet beneath my fingers. In the end, this wasn't just about a house, it was about standing up for yourself, about protecting what matters, about finding your voice even when others try to silence it. And as I sat there, in my imperfect, beautiful, hard-won home, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even, it's about living well, on your own terms, in a house that tells your story, every creaking floorboard, every restored window, every eccentric choice that makes it uniquely, unquestionably yours. The next morning, I received a text from Margaret, the wallpaper in the powder room. "It's growing on me." I smiled as I typed my response. "Just wait until you see what I have planned for the conservatory, because that's the thing about houses, and families, and life itself, there's always room for renovation, for growth, for change. You just have to be brave enough to pick up the tools and start the work."